Hello everyone. Today we will be talking about development of face. So let's begin. Now let's begin talking about the face. During 4th week of development after formation of head fold, two prominent bulges appear. Okay, they appear on the ventral aspect of the embryo. Alright, now these two bulges are nothing but cranially it is a brain which is in formation, and then the second bulge is pericardium. Alright, now these two bulges are separated by stomatium. Alright, and the floor of stomatium is formed by buccopharyngeal membrane which separates it from foregut as seen in the picture. Okay, now the mesoderm, alright, which is covering this forebrain proliferates and forms a downward projection. Alright, now this downward projection is nothing but the frontonasal process. Okay, so basically face is derived from the structures around the stomodium. Okay, first is unpaired frontonasal process and the other is paired maxillary process and mandibular process. Now let's understand how these are formed. Okay, mandibular arch is the first pharyngeal arch. Correct. Now this mandibular arch is formed on the lateral walls of stomodium. Okay, present on the either side of stomodium basically. Now this mandibular arch gives off a bud from its dorsal end, which is nothing but the maxillary process. Alright, now as the growth development occurs further, what happens is this mandibular process starts to grow ventromedially. Okay, that is, it starts to meet in the center from the either side. Alright, the ectoderm overlying the frontonasal process shows bilateral localized thickening situated above the stomodium on either side of midline. Okay, so you see on the either side of the stomodium you will see thickening occurring from the ectoderm. Okay, and this is formation of nasal placods. Alright, and it is induced by forebrain. These placods sink below the surface and forms nasal pits, okay, which are continuous with stomatium below. The edges of each pit are raised above the surface. Alright, now when it is raised medially, it is nothing but your medial nasal process, and when raised laterally, it is nothing but your lateral nasal process. Alright, now if you see just little above the nasal placods, you will see lens placods. Okay, now they are present cranially and laterally to the nasal placods. Okay, a pair of thickening occurs, which is nothing but your lens placods. Now this lens placod will further form your eyes. Okay, now moving ahead, what happened, the mandibular process which was present on the either side had started to come closer or grow medially, correct, and it ended up fusing in the midline, forming the lower jaw boundary, the lower margin of stomatium, and it also further forms the lower lip. Alright, now what happens with the maxillary process? The maxillary process had also started growing medially, correct, but instead of fusing in the midline, it ended up fusing with the lateral nasal processes. Okay, now this lateral nasal processes starts to come close to each other. Okay, first of all they are cut from stomatium after maxillary process has fused with the lateral nasal process. Second thing, now what happens over here is because the lateral nasal processes have started to come close to each other, the frontonasal process has started to become narrow. Okay, because of which external nasal pit comes together. Alright, the mesodermal basis of lateral part of lip is formed from maxillary process. Okay, whereas the overlying skin of this upper lip is formed from ectoderm. Alright, then the mesodermal basis of median or the middle part of lip or philtrum is formed from frontonasal process, correct? Because you remember what happened, the frontonasal process has started to shrink or had become thinner, correct? So the mesodermal basis of this frontonasal process form the median of the or the middle part of the lip, which is also known as philtrum. Okay, the ectoderm of maxillary process overgrows this mesoderm. Okay, meets the maxillary process on the opposite side. All right, in the midline, of course. Okay, because of which skin of upper lip is innervated by maxillary nerves. Now, I hope we are clear with the formation of upper lip and lower lip. Alright, we understood that the mandibular process had fused in the midline, the maxillary process has fused with the lateral nasal processes, correct? And then, now what happens? This maxillary process and mandibular process fuse together, forming cheeks. Okay? Now we all understood that the maxillary process was fused with lateral nasal process. The fusion occurs at the region of lip and extends from stomatium to median angle, okay, in the center of developing eye. There was lens placard which was forming an eye, correct? So the line of fusion is marked by a groove known as naso-optic furrow or nasolacrimal sulcus. Okay, this ectoderm becomes buried along this furrow, giving rise to nasolacrimal duct. All right, now we all knew that above the nasal placard there was lens placard which was there, which was nothing again but the ectodermal thickening, right, which had appeared where it had appeared laterally or ventrolateral side of developing forebrain, correct? And cranial and lateral to the nasal placard. Now this lens placard basically sinks below the surface, okay, is cut off from surface ectoderm and a bulge is produced which further forms the eyeball, okay? And as the frontonasal process starts to shrink, as your nose has started to form, correct, the eyes also come in the midline or comes medially, okay? So with nose we all understood that the maxillary process had fused with the medial nasal process, okay, which was cut off from stomatium, forming what, external nares. All right, now this external nares started coming close to each other, because of which what happened, the frontonasal process had started to narrow down or to shrink. Okay, now it forms the deeper part of nasal septum. All right, and the mesoderm which were hipped up in the median plane forms the prominence of the nose. Okay, simultaneously a groove appears between the region of nose and bulging forebrain. Okay, as the nose becomes prominent, these external nares come to open downwards instead of forward. Okay, so this is how your complete nose is formed. So to sum it up, external nose is formed from fusion of 5 processes: frontonasal process, which forms the bridge of the nose; fused medial nasal process from dorsum and tip of nose; okay, lateral nasal process form alley of the nose, okay, and the nasal cavities are formed by extension of nasal pits, which were first communication with stomatium, okay, and the frontonasal process is between the nasal pit forming the nasal septum. Now remember this, okay, because this will be also helpful in formation of palate. All right, so this is all about the nose you need to know. Now let's begin talking about the development of palate. Let's understand how palate is formed. Okay, palate is formed from maxillary process which forms palatine process. Okay, and then there is frontonasal process which forms the premaxilla. Okay, premaxilla is also known as primary palate, whereas the palatine process is also known as secondary palate. Alright, now what happened? The maxillary process had fused with the lateral nasal processes, correct. Now as these lateral nasal process had started coming closer to each other, the frontonasal process had narrowed down. Okay, now it narrowed down so much that it formed a wedge at the deeper level. Okay, from mesocyne. Okay, so that forms nothing but your premaxilla. So fusion of two medial nasal processes, okay, with the narrow downing of the frontonasal processes at deeper level, it forms a wedge-shaped mass of mesocyne opposite jaw. Okay, carrying four incisor teeth, and that is nothing but your premaxilla. Understood? Now, in the lower region tongue was developing, correct. So the palatine process of maxilla are hook like projections on either side of tongue which assume horizontal position above the tongue, fuse with each other forming secondary palate. Okay, now the mesoderm in this palate starts to go intramembranous ossification forming hard palate, and the posterior region where ossification doesn't take place remains as a soft palate. Okay, so the secondary palate basically forms hard palate and soft palate. So fusion of palatine processes of maxilla with primitive palate, okay, occurs in a Y-shaped manner. Understood? And each limb of Y extends between lateral incisor and canine, and junction of these two components in the midline form incisive fossa. Okay, fusion of both palatal process of maxilla, okay, they fuse in midline, and fusion begins first anteriorly and moves backward in the posterior region. Okay, now fusion of palatal process with nasal septum. Remember, the nasal septum was formed of frontonasal process, correct. Now what happens is the medial edges of palatal process fuse with free lower edge of nasal septum, okay, separating two nasal cavities and form from each other, and separating the mouth also from the nose. Okay, so this is all about the phase that we need to speak or you need to know. Thank you. Like, share and subscribe, and please leave a comment. Thank you.